Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Larian Studios has always been a very ambitious game developer. Their humble beginnings were not so humble at all actually. The amount of features they managed to cram in their first RPG ever was absolutely impressive to say the least. Divinity came out in 2002 and it plays similar to Diablo 2, but it had a lot more RPG features, a fully open world, branching dialogue options, very interactable environments and so on. The scope of the game was incredible and it had some bugs and glitches because of this, but for the most part it was an amazing achievement. And more importantly, a very fun RPG.
I feel ready to fight on.
That was quite impressive for a first RPG by a small studio, right? However, Divinity was technically not their first RPG. There was a cancelled game called The Lady, the Mage and the Knight. Larian was founded in 1996 and they started working on this game with another studio called Attic Entertainment Software. There is a prototype of this game on the internet that's available to download and I tried it out for a little bit. It has a lot of technical issues and bugs obviously, and it crashes every time I die. But this cancelled game has a lot of similar features, which we're going to see in their first official RPG. These two studios apparently had a lot of issues with the development, and they also didn't get along with the publisher, which resulted in a game being cancelled in 1999. I guess this is what inspired Larian to publish their own games, but they still had to wait for a while for this to happen. In 2013, they released a game called Divinity Dragon Commander, and this was the first game that was officially developed and published by Larian. Every game that came out after this was also developed and published by Larian. They officially released 7 games, and only one of them is a real-time strategy, which will be the game I just mentioned. Which leaves us with 6 RPGs in total from this amazing little studio. Well, they were a small studio back in the day, but after a much-deserved success with original Sin RPGs, they started getting a lot bigger. Fast forward to 2023, the astronomical success of Baldur's Gate 3 has pushed this studio to the mainstream level. If Baldur's Gate 3 was your first RPG from this developer, I'm here to show you that Larian did not exactly come out of nowhere.
Not a trick, my friend. Magic.
And that most RPGs they made in the past were really ambitious and underrated, despite all the problems they had. So let's take a look at the long repertoire of RPGs from Larian Studios. Right after I tell you about the sponsor of this video. Raid Shadow Legends has fresh new champions to collect. With over 700 champions in the game, each with their own unique spells and abilities, you can definitely make a very unique party. All of these champions come from different factions like Lizardmen, Orcs, Undead, or from the rest of 15 awesome factions. My favorite champion is Turvold, because he's a Viking-like character with a very cool two-handed sword. Find out why 400 million players in 190 countries are playing this mobile RPG and stick around to get some unique in-game rewards. Take your party of champions to different game modes, like terrifying dungeons, where brutal bosses push your tactical skills to the max. Or maybe you prefer the PvP combats. Join the newly added live arena and battle the players from all around the world in 3 exciting PvP modes. Raid has constant updates and they keep adding new modes, features and champions to ensure there's always a new challenge to take on. They just added a fearsome new boss, Akumori the Phantom Shogun. You practically have infinite ways to test out team compositions, tweak your champion's build and optimize your epic party. It's very easy to play on mobile, or take your progress and transfer it to desktop so the fun never stops. You can also get your hands on the Stag Knight, one of the best epic champions around, as well as a skin for the Stag Knight designed by Jontron. Just use the promo code you see on the screen before October 7th. If you're not a new player, don't worry though, you can still get the Stag Knight and the skin through in-game events. Download Raid right now by using my link in the description or by scanning the QR code and get an epic champion Drake along with some other very useful items. Once you're in the game, you can find me under the name Click for Gameplay. Number 1. Divinity. Divinity was an open-world action RPG released in 2002. At the first glance, it seemed like this game was another clone of Diablo 2. Yeah, back in the day the word Diablo clone was used a lot and mostly in negative connotation. However, this game had a lot more RPG features and it played a bit differently compared to the hack and slash nature of Diablo 2. First of all, Divinity is quite possibly one of the worst names for a game. A while back I asked my community about the worst game names and Divinity popped out quite often. What's interesting about this, Larian was supposed to name this game Divinity Sword of Lies, which sounds a lot better. I don't know why they decided to change the name, but whatever. Divinity is still very playable today, if you're willing to tolerate some annoying problems with the game. The UI is very tedious to navigate, you can't keybind some important actions like healing, the game can be buggy and it has clunky controls, which take a while to get used to. Those will be some of those issues. If you get past those issues, you're in for a very enjoyable RPG experience. The game starts by letting you choose between 3 character classes. You can be a mage, survivor, or a warrior. But Divinity is actually a classless RPG. No matter which class you choose here, you'll be able to learn skills from all classes. You also have traditional RPG stats which will affect your build. The game starts in the village of Alarot and you can immediately sense the scope of the world. The village is pretty damn big. Your first major mission is to find a cure for an old mage who became insane for some reason. Not all dialogue lines are voice acted, but there is still a lot of voice acting in the game. The quality of voice acting back in the day was not that great in general, so don't expect much.
Mardanius, my poor old friend. What are you doing outside?
What? Oh, it's you, Landlord. I was... Ah, he will come!
You're raving, Mardanius.
But Larian games always had a very silly sense of humor, and you're going to have some hilarious interactions with NPCs. There are a bunch of scripted events, and they're usually quite entertaining. How about a couple of skeletons that have an existential crisis, so they just drop dead for some reason?
I mean, if you think about it, we don't have no muscles or flesh on our bones either, so what keeps us together, sort of thing, huh?
Best not to think about it. I don't want to fall to bits because of excess existential thought. Nasty.
Yeah, you can expect a lot of similar interactions. This is essentially a story-driven RPG and there are branching dialogue options as well. However, that doesn't mean the game lacks engaging gameplay features. Granted, some of those features feel pretty outdated for today's standards, but I still think the game is very fun. Especially when your character starts getting stronger and gets some good items. Speaking of which, the combat in this game has similarities with Diablo-like games, but there are some key differences. The enemies you kill will never respawn, and I'm pretty sure they have fixed levels. That means that you can encounter some very strong enemies early on, but this depends on the zone you're exploring. The first main quest takes you through a huge set of dungeons beneath the village. But the level design is very clever and you find a couple of shortcuts which can easily take you from even the lowest level of the dungeon back to the village. What's even better, you don't only get to mindlessly hack and slash these enemies. Each dungeon level has something interesting to figure out in order to proceed, but I never found those activities tedious. The map is not randomly generated, it's a traditional static open world. That's usually what I prefer, to be honest, because it feels more authentic and immersive. I'm not against procedurally generated terrain systems, which some ARPGs use. But if I had to pick, I would always go for a handcrafted open world. Anyway, what can feel a bit tedious are difficulty spikes, which you're definitely going to experience. Regular enemies have a decent amount of challenge, you have to watch for your health and try to find gear upgrades. But pretty much every stronger NPC in the game can destroy you if you're not ready. So even though it's an open world, you will have to find an area which you can handle and gain enough XP to level up before you can try to kill some stronger enemies. You will definitely hit a brick wall sometimes because of this, and some people might find it very annoying because it really hinders your progression. But it also encourages you to think a bit more and possibly try to explore other areas first. Orcs have invaded the outskirts of the first village, and if you try to fight them early on, you will get one-shotted. But this only makes the progression more impactful if you're willing to accept how the game works. The items you're going to find usually require you to have more stats, but I like this kind of progression. It gives me something to look forward to. The healing is very tight in the game, as well as the economy, but it becomes much easier later on. The skills you can get are not extremely interesting, to be honest. A lot of these skills feel like utility, which is definitely useful but kinda boring. Besides that, I found the gameplay very fun and interesting, especially when you start exploring the open world. Controlling the character is definitely a bit clumsy, and clicking on enemies to kill them doesn't feel that good like in Diablo 2 for example, or pretty much any modern ARPG, but that's not the point. You won't have to be extremely precise in combat anyway, so I don't think it's a huge deal. And you know me, I'm always in a mood for some janky gameplay, so it doesn't bother me personally. especially when all other RPG features are really fun. I love how you can click and move a lot of items on the map, just like in point-and-click adventures. Larian games always had very interactive worlds, which you can see even in the first game ever. Even that prototype I mentioned before had the same feature. They're just going to keep improving those interactive features with each new title. You can sink many hours into this RPG, and it doesn't look that bad in full HD even today. The game has a recognizable Larian charm, but you will hear me repeat that sentence for all of their games. Not to mention that you can replay this game like crazy if you end up liking it. Overall, the reception for Divine Divinity was pretty good, and it was a huge step into the right direction. Number 2. Beyond Divinity. Beyond Divinity is the second official RPG from Larian, which came out in 2004. At first glance, this game looks very similar to Divine Divinity. Visually it looks pretty much the same, even though there are some improvements, which were a lot more prominent back then. The game uses a lot of the same assets, the UI looks the same for the most part, and so on. But once you start playing, you're immediately going to notice some massive differences. I was always wondering why this game has mixed reviews, and why it was received a lot worse compared to Divine Divinity. And it only took me a couple of hours of gameplay to figure that out. However, I still don't hate this game, even though it has some serious issues that we're going to talk about. Unlike Divine Divinity, I never played this game before, so I didn't know what to expect. First of all, Beyond Divinity has a very interesting premise. The story takes place 20 years after the first game. Once again, you get to make a custom character and choose one of 3 classes with some light character customization. Then you get another character after you finish making your main. The Death Knight is your second party member that you get to control. Your main character is basically a necromancer hunter, but he's been imprisoned, and that's where the game starts. The Death Knight approaches your cell and he tells you that your souls are forged together, so you're pretty much forced to work together. This is one of those game ideas that sound very interesting in theory, but not so much in practice. The Death Knight is an amusing character in general, and he has a lot of funny dialogue lines. He sounds like he's trying really hard to be evil, which he essentially is, I guess. But the voice acting and his delivery makes him funny.
Well, we certainly won't get far with the rubbish you've been picking up, human.
The sense of humor is almost on the same level like in the first game, but the voice acting got a bit worse. However, the sequel has voice acting for all dialogue lines, which was not the case in the first game. You'll get to see some scripted, silly encounters with NPCs, like in the first game. They are not that good like in Divine Divinity, but still, they're decent. Overall, I cared a lot less about the story in this game, even though I really liked the Death Knight character. But the story is not a problem in this game at all. Like I mentioned before, the premise sounds interesting on paper, but it makes some parts of the gameplay really frustrating. From the very beginning of the game, you're going to control 2 characters, so it's essentially a party-based RPG, which by default makes this game a lot different compared to Divine Divinity. It also plays way differently. Beyond Divinity has a real-time action combat with pause, and it's a lot more tactical compared to the first game. You're going to use the pause button very often in fights and issue commands to your party members. Once again, the UI makes the game a lot clunkier than it should be, and you'll have to click on things a lot instead of just keep bounding it. Healing is equally frustrating in this game, but that's only a minor problem with the gameplay. Remember when I mentioned that Divine Divinity has some big difficulty spikes? Well, Beyond Divinity said hold my beer please and let me multiply that problem by 10. It's a lot worse, that's what I'm trying to say. I made the mistake by trying to play it on the tactical difficulty, but I quickly brought the difficulty down to normal. But even so, it can still be a very frustrating experience, especially if you try to build a more non-combat oriented character. It's totally unplayable if you try to play it like that, according to a lot of people at least. I played as a warrior, and I also tried to build my Death Knight as a tank warrior, I guess. You can easily get destroyed in combat, even on normal difficulty. The reason why it feels way worse compared to the first game is the linear nature of the game. Beyond Divinity is way more linear, especially in the first 5 or 6 hours of gameplay. It opens up a lot more later on, but it still doesn't feel that open like the first game. That would not be a problem if the balancing issues were sorted out. Remember when I said that even when you hit a brick wall in Divine Divinity, you can still usually do something about it? Like try to explore a different area, find some better gear or another quest. Well, you're pretty much forced on a linear path in Beyond Divinity, so the balancing issues just get magnified. Up to the point where it can make you quit the game, but I didn't want to do that. One of the main mechanics comes from the idea of being soul forged to the Death Knight, which means that only one of you has to die for the game to end. It makes sense from the story perspective, but this quickly gets frustrating. It makes the already very unbalanced game even more unbalanced. I still didn't complete the game, but I will eventually because I still like it a lot and I do enjoy the challenge, despite all the balancing issues. If you can get past the opening dungeon, which takes forever to complete, you will probably start liking the game a lot more. I did enjoy some harder fights because it makes you use everything you have. For example, I ran out of healing potions in this fight and I switched weapons on both characters. I tried to kite him with range attacks. It felt great, in a way. But seriously though, the beginning dungeon is huge and not in the same way like dungeons in Divine Divinity. The first game had wider rooms in dungeons with multiple levels, while Beyond Divinity has more linear paths. I think the first game has a much better game world in general and it's a lot more enjoyable to explore. I don't know if I would recommend playing this game. Recommending Divine Divinity was a no-brainer, but I can't say the same about the sequel, although you be the judge. Overall, I did enjoy my time with it and I still didn't complete the game, but I definitely plan to.
Stop snivelling, Brian. Remember our task. Only the master shall pass.
Number 3. Divinity 2 Ego Draconis.
What's the matter with you? You look like you've seen a ghost.
Divinity 2 Ego Draconis, or The Dragon Saga, or Developer's Cut. Yeah, if you even know this game exists, you might know it by one of these names. Larian is a very creative game studio, but not so creative when it comes to naming their games. Up to the point that many people would just get confused by the naming scheme, and rightfully so. When you mention Divinity 2, 99% of people will think about Original Sin 2. Larian even tried to put a warning sign on Steam if you accidentally click on this game, which was kinda sad. This is the first and the last time that Larian developed a third-person action RPG. And I really hope to see another similar RPG from Larian in the future, especially now after the huge success with Baldur's Gate 3. Anyway, I did a pretty long retrospective video about this game not so long ago, so I'm going to play you a much shorter version in this video. And if you're interested, you can always check out the full retrospective video. I'm actually really proud how it turned out. Divinity 2 Ego Draconis came out in 2009 for PC and Xbox 360. The reception of this game was decent, but it definitely got overlooked and it had a very quiet release. Unfortunately, Larian wasn't able to change this, even though they re-released the game a couple of times. Shortly after the release of one and only DLC for the game called Flames of Vengeance, they released the Dragon Knight Saga. This was basically the complete package where we get the base game along with the DLC, but Larian also included a huge balancing patch within this package. It had a lot of changes to the base game based on community feedback. And then finally we got Developer's Cut in the late 2012. This version of the game allows you to enable cheats and play around with various aspects of the game that were inaccessible before. This is the only digital version of the game that you can get today on your PC, by the way. But what about the game itself, C4G? Is it any good? Well, I'm glad you asked.
But I shall waste words on you no longer.
While the premise of the main story just screams cliché, the actual story itself is pretty interesting. And there are definitely some memorable characters that you're going to meet throughout the game. By the way, you don't have to worry about any major spoilers in this video. Anyway, the main story has a couple of interesting twists and turns, and the first one happens right after the tutorial section of the game. You start off as the member of an elite soldier unit called the Dragon Slayers. The name of this unit should give you a hint what they're all about. On the other side we have Dragon Knights, the chosen champions of real dragons who can transform into, well, dragons. The Slayers had been hunting Dragon Knights for God knows how long, because they killed Lucian the Divine. Lucian the Divine was actually the player character from the first Divinity game, Divine Divinity. From the very beginning, almost every dialogue line that you can select is filled with jokes and references.
Here lies Sleepy Joe, doing what he does best.
This persists through the whole game, and more than often it gets really ridiculous.
You are starting to vex me, servant of the serpent.
This time I'll see you in pieces once more, prostitute of the pervert. What the fuck?
Your tongue is still sharp as always.
The consequences for your decisions in quest solving are well designed as well. These quests usually have a very different outcome depending on your choice of action. For example, in one of the dungeons I was randomly exploring, I came across this crazy chicken room.
What is this? A chicken run and a chicken room?
You get to loot a chicken rune here, but at the time I couldn't do anything with it. This was just an optional side room of the dungeon, but later I accepted the quest for some necromancer who was about to destroy the whole village. And you can resolve this quest peacefully by getting him the chicken rune, which allows him to have unlimited fried chicken. There are many fun and crazy quests like this, but I won't spoil it for you.
Sic transit gloria mundi!
No, that one doesn't work either.
However, the main quest is completely linear. When it comes to the story itself, it's always the same outcome. But even some main quests have different options that you have to pick, even though they don't exactly affect the main story. Like I said before, I always felt like the main goal of this studio is to make a fun game. Even before you get a weapon in the beginning, you can mess around with the combat system and kick chickens to death. You'll immediately notice some over-the-top animations and more than generous jumping ability. Anyway, the combat in Divinity 2 is fast-paced, but you also have a tactical pause button, which I never use that much to be honest. The most useful function of this feature is to automatically pause the game when your health is low, so you can heal. But you can also issue commands from the pause menu if you wish. The feel of the combat is decent, and I always have a lot of fun with trying out different abilities and mix and matching them to create a unique build. However, there are some parts of this combat system which are pretty bad, up to the point where it almost made me quit this playthrough because I got really mad. But you shouldn't get turned off by this, because this is mostly a critique for the Nightmare difficulty. I played almost the entire game on Nightmare, which was probably the worst decision I made when it comes to this game. It's absolutely an awful way of doing a difficulty in a game of this type, and I highly recommend playing it on normal. Getting stronger in this game and the whole progression system in general is really good. Leveling up always gives you a considerable power boost, no matter where you choose to dump your ability points. You also have classic RPG stat points that you get to distribute. When it comes to the controls, they are decent, but I wouldn't exactly call them snappy, mainly because the majority of actions in combat have long animation lock, whether that's regular attacks, using abilities, pulling out your weapons, or getting hit. When it comes to my character, I wanted to focus on melee and some ranged abilities with the bow. The game has a very useful switch for 3 different weapon sets of your choice. This is probably the most seamless feature in the combat system because there is zero delay when you switch your weapons. You can even do it while jumping. What's even better when it comes to this, the game is smart enough to automatically equip a corresponding weapon type when you use your abilities. So for example, you can shoot your arrows with a bow and use ranged abilities. But if you try to use some melee abilities while shooting with a bow, the game will automatically switch to your previously selected weapon slot and seamlessly cast the ability. This definitely deserves some praise because it's a great feature. When it comes to the dragon gameplay, it's more of a gimmick than anything else, to be honest. Although the second major area of the game is completely designed around this feature. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely not a bad experience, but the whole dragon form is revolved around destroying towers and occasionally killing some dragons with a single button. Flying around in the second area is really fun though. Fun fact, there was supposed to be another form which was halfway between the dragon and human forms. And that form was supposed to be very powerful for fighting on the ground. This is really interesting, and once again you can see how ambitious Larian was. Speaking about underdeveloped features, we have to mention the battle tower you get quite late in the game. Actually, I wouldn't call the battle tower underdeveloped, it was just introduced very late in the game. The battle tower is your hub area where you have the complete list of features which the game offers. You can store items, mix potions, enchant armors and weapons, and even create your own monster from various body parts you loot. This is a very cool feature actually, that you can unlock even before you get a tower. Your monster gets different abilities depending on which body parts you choose. Overall, Divinity 2 Ego Draconis was and still is one of my most favorite action RPGs. I would highly recommend playing this game today. I also recently made a second channel and I talked about Larian's future plans in one of the videos and how awesome would be to see another similar game like this from Larian. Feel free to check that out as well. Number 4. Divinity Original Sin 1.
Time of your death is at hand.
Before this game came out, Larian also tried to experiment a bit with that Dragon's Commander game I mentioned before. So that would be 3 different subgenres of RPGs and 1 RTS game, so Larian really tried to experiment a little bit. However, Divinity Original Sin was like back to the roots game. Well, kinda. The turn-based nature of this game was completely different from anything they did before, but they already had a lot of experience with isometric RPGs. It's astonishing to me how flexible this studio actually is, especially if we take in consideration the quality of all of these games. Original Sin 1 was definitely a big turning point for Larian. They started gaining a much bigger following after this game released, and the reception for it was really good. I had an amazing experience with this game when it first came out. First of all, I personally am not a huge fan of turn-based RPGs, and I only like a handful of them. That's just me, but Divinity Original Sin pretty much changed how I think about turn-based games in general. If you're wondering, my personal problem with these kinds of games is on the fundamental level because I think the gameplay is too slow to be enjoyable and it can be a drag. On the other side, they can be really chill games to play because of that same reason. Larian kept a lot of features that I already loved in their previous games, so it was not that hard to enjoy this game. I like the intro cutscene and it does a good job to set up the story. I found the story of this game to be very engaging from the very beginning. It basically starts off as a big murder investigation and it slowly builds up. It becomes a lot deeper as you progress, but I like how simple it is in the beginning. This is something that Larian does very well in pretty much all of their games. Anyway, you play as a source hunter, a group of people who is responsible for eliminating dangerous types of magic known as the source. You actually start the game with 2 different source hunters that you can fully customize however you like. Another reason for starting with 2 characters were the co-op features that Larian implemented for the first time ever. You could play the game in couch co-op, in the split screen mode, or join the online co-op. That was amazing because up to that point the split screen co-op in RPGs was pretty much dead, especially on PC. What was really impressive about this are different options you can choose in dialogue with both characters. Both players will get to engage in dialogue situations and select different options. And when you get to disagree with your partner, you get to play a little game of rock, paper, scissors. A lot of these features I mentioned were included in the enhanced version of the game, which came out in late 2015. The original version of the game, now known as Classic, didn't have nowhere near the amount of features like the enhanced version. And it's very rare to see a studio re-release the game and get a lot more attention and better reception in general. The enhanced version has added full voice acting for all dialogue lines, which was pretty impressive considering the amount of dialogue the game has. But it also added more features, and it revamped some existing features as well. It was kinda crazy. Anyway, there are a bunch of different classes which are presented really well. The presentation in this game is leagues better than anything else which Larian did in the past. Even if you don't know anything about RPGs, I think you wouldn't have a lot of issues to figure out what these classes are capable of. What's even better, the UI seamlessly switch depending on the input you use. I use the controller on the PC just because I got too lazy these days and I like to lean on my chair. Yeah, I'm an old man, shut the f*** up. Larian put a big emphasis on the interactive environment while showcasing the gameplay, which is something that Larian will keep doing in their newer games as well, and it was a great game design decision and marketing decision actually. However, if you played Larian games before, this was nothing new, their games were pretty much always like this. Not to this extent though, but you know what I mean. Anyway, I was generally surprised how much I enjoyed the gameplay in Original Sin. Come to think of it, Beyond Divinity played really similar to turn-based RPGs. You would pause the game religiously to issue commands. Mostly to heal and position your characters, but still. So it kinda makes sense why they decided to switch to this gameplay. There are 4 different maps in the game which are very open and fun to explore. Overall, Original Sin was a really important game for Larian Studio because it put them on the map once again. They will make a right move and try to capitalize on this success by making a direct sequel and stop trying to experiment with different RPG subgenres with each new game. Number 5. Divinity Original Sin 2. Divinity Original Sin 2 is a sequel to Original Sin 1, obviously. It came out in 2017 and people absolutely loved it from the very beginning. This was the first time when Larian managed to reach the mainstream level with almost 100k people active on Steam at one point. Original Sin 2 was bigger and better compared to the first game. It felt like a much higher budget game from the very beginning. That by itself would not mean a lot if other features of the game were not so good. However, Larian gained a lot of experience from their previous titles, so it was no surprise they managed to improve, well, everything. The story was pretty good in the first original Sin, and that game had some memorable characters. But the sequel took this to a whole another level. Now you have the option to choose one of 6 pre-made characters or make a completely custom character with a pretty good customization system. All of these pre-made characters are very memorable and they have distinctive personalities.
Quite right. Do seek my counsel. I highly recommend it.
There is a short background story that you can see for each and every one of these pre-made characters, which is a great introduction segment. That wouldn't be possible without a great presentation, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but yeah, Larian improved that as well. The voice acting is really good in this game, and the character models had some very noticeable improvements.
Ah, my false faces. Not as fair as my true visage, but better than being seen as a monster.
I like to play with a custom character, and I actually think it's a way better option in the game for one simple reason. You're going to meet all of these characters in the game anyway, and you can have them as companions. The only downside, I guess, is not being able to have more than 3 of them in your party as a custom-made character. So you're probably going to miss out on some banter between them. I really can't stress enough how good of a job Larian did with these characters. They behave differently, they have their own goals in the game, but you can also choose to kill everyone if you can. And if you watch my reviews, you know how much I love such features in RPGs, since they create a great sense of freedom. It takes some balls to give you the option to kill off such interesting and well-made characters. Not a lot of RPGs allow you to do that, unless we're talking about some heavily scripted scenarios in the story. Original Sin 2 is not exactly a sandbox RPG, you have a story you have to follow and progress, but some of its features like this will give you that sandbox freedom. Ironically, the first major area of the game is a prison. Larian flipped the script with Original Sin 2. In the first game, you played as someone who hunts people who can use source magic. But in Original Sin 2, your characters have the ability to cast dangerous source magic. Although the story of the sequel takes place centuries after the first game, so there is no direct connection. Fort Joy is the beginning island of this game, and people with source magic are imprisoned here with magical collars. These collars basically prevents them from casting source magic, because doing so will attract the monsters from the void. Now, the story gets more complex obviously, but if we continue, we're going to spend an hour talking about it. The gameplay is very similar to the first game, but it obviously has a lot of improvements and some notable changes. The inclusion of physical and magic armor is quite possibly the most notable change. All NPCs have a physical and magic armor stat which you can see above their health. Different gear pieces as well as some other sources will increase your armor, which is quite an important stat in the game. I remember this being a very controversial change among some fans of Original Sin. But I personally love this feature because it made it more fun to pick and choose the right armor pieces for your characters. It's also a big part of your combat strategy, and it's something you always have to keep in mind when fighting enemies, especially on hard difficulties. I always play this game on tactical mode, which offers a very nice challenge without being too tedious. Enemies will use the environment to their advantage whenever they can, which makes every encounter really fun. One of the things which Original Sin 2 does exceptionally well is the early game. I talked about this in one of my older videos on the channel. I personally think that early game in RPGs is very important for creating that sense of progression. While Original Sin 1 did a great job with this as well, the sequel does it even better. You have multiple ways to get where you need to go while using everything or everyone you can find in Fort Joy. Some fights can be really challenging if you don't equip yourself right, and there are multiple ways to do that as well. You start off by wearing a bucket for a helmet and you gradually improve from there. I enjoyed the itemization a lot more in this game than in Original Sin 1. There are a bunch of secrets to find, unique interactions with NPCs and so on. It feels feature complete, full of content, with a really strong replay value. Not to mention the other game modes like Game Master that some people might find interesting. And for the first time ever, I was running this game on 4K and it looks absolutely amazing on my TV. To put it this way, Original Sin 2 was close to a masterpiece and it truly seemed like Larian peaked with this game. If you told me back then that Larian's next game is going to completely overshadow Original Sin 2, I would not believe you, to say the least. But as we know now, that's exactly what happens. Number 6. Baldur's Gate 3.
Zoru was right. Yellow as a toad, twice as ugly.
Before Larian acquired the rights for Baldur's Gate IP, they were actually working on a new Divinity game. Divinity Fallen Heroes was supposed to be an XCOM style game, and it was going to continue the story of Original Sin 2. Larian was working on both games for a while when they finally decided to focus only on one project and do it right. So Fallen Heroes hit the shelf and Baldur's Gate 3 development was in full swing. This game first came out in early access on Steam in late 2020. I did play it back then, but my playtime was very short because I wanted to wait for the full game. And fast forward to 2023, we got the full game and it totally broke the internet. 875k was the peak on Steam, which puts it in top 10 biggest games on Steam ever. I honestly couldn't be happier for Larian because I was a fan of this studio for so long and people are finally giving them their flowers. As for the game, we can say without a doubt that Baldur's Gate 3 is Larian's magnus opus. They acquired a famous IP and made an amazing sequel that will be played for years to come.
It's like they say, no fun in skewing a pig what doesn't know he's cooked.
I had no doubts that Baldur's Gate 3 is going to look very similar to Original Sin 2. But this time around, they decided to make a D&D turn-based RPG, which makes the feel of the gameplay quite different on the fundamental level. To tell you the truth, I'm not a huge fan of D&D rules, so I had my concerns about the game. I had similar concerns before Original Sin 1 came out. However, when I finally got my hands on the game, my concerns completely disappeared. Larian used the same formula for setting up the story and characters in Baldur's Gate 3. You can choose to play as one of the pre-made characters or go with a custom character with plenty of customization options. As always, I chose to stick with a customizable character and I think I made Geralt if he was played by Jared Leto. Anyway, the story in Baldur's Gate 3 starts off really simple as well. There is a parasite in your head which will eventually turn you into this hideous creature called the Mind Flayer. All of the pre-made characters that you can meet and recruit in your party have the same disease, which means that you have something in common by default. I honestly thought it's going to be very hard for Larian to create even better characters than in Original Sin 2, but they did. Way better actually. Not only because these characters are really well developed, which they definitely are. Come to think of it, they have more character development in the first 10 hours than some RPGs have in the full length of the game. But other features like the presentation now have a AAA quality feel to them. Even though technically the game is not a AAA RPG. The character models are vastly improved once again, the voice acting is simply amazing, and the amount of attention to detail can be absolutely insane.
Shadowheart's attention is fixed on a damaged old statue.
This wouldn't be possible if Larian made everything from the scratch again, like they did in the past. Instead, they took everything which made Original Sin 2 great and just started improving it. This was good news for the majority of people who played and enjoyed that game, and bad news for some people who didn't like Original Sin games for whatever reason. Baldur's Gate 3 feels very similar to Original Sin 2, there is no doubt about it. Anyway, the parasite that's in your head plays a major role in dialogue options and how all of these characters behave in general. But even besides that, all of them have secrets and agendas, which makes them even more believable and memorable. Larian was always known for some silly humor segments in their games. However, they dialed that up to 11 in Baldur's Gate 3.
What the hell are you doing?
You gotta love how this game didn't have a proper marketing campaign, and yet it managed to achieve such high sale numbers. Confirming the possibility to have sex with druid bears was the only marketing campaign they ever needed. And besides that, the game has plethora of funny and bizarre encounters to break the monotony.
Says here that goblinoids are obstreperous and malodorous. What's that mean?
As for the gameplay, literally everything you do in this game is based on some D&D rule. It can get a bit annoying if you ask me, but not to the point where it becomes a big deal. Once again, we can enjoy an immense freedom of choice and actions in the game, so you're free to kill whoever you want, if that's what you desire. Larian seems hell-bent to keep this sandbox feature in their RPGs, and I'm a huge fan of that. The environment can be your friend or your biggest enemy in fights, or you can totally avoid a lot of fight encounters with different dialogue options. The dice rolling gameplay has its advantages, but I never liked it that much on the fundamental level, especially in dialogue. This kinda encourages save scumming, but it also depends on the player type, I guess. You can find yourself in important dialogue situations, and if you fail the dice roll, there is a big chance you're going to die. The thing I like about this is the lack of level scaling zones and enemies. You can stumble upon some enemies that are not even worth fighting before you improve your characters. On the other side, when you fail the dice roll, there is no point in fighting these kinds of enemies anyway. Those are just my personal, minor issues with some of the gameplay features in turn-based D&D games. Putting that aside, the gameplay in Baldur's Gate 3 is very enjoyable and immersive. That being said, Baldur's Gate 3 does a phenomenal job with the camp feature because there is always something interesting happening when you rest. Some of these interactions can almost change your entire playthrough. The exploration is very immersive and enjoyable. There are some improvements on this field as well, like being able to jump, which automatically makes the exploration more vertical. Original Sin 2 didn't have this feature, so it's a welcoming change. It really affects how you explore these maps. And just in general, your characters seem to have less problems while traversing the terrain. The animations for walking are still kinda goofy, but that's like whatever. Overall, the combat is very enjoyable and challenging in the game. Well, at least for me, the guy that doesn't play a lot of turn-based RPGs. I'm taking my time with Baldur's Gate 3, so I'm yet to finish it. I really didn't want to rush it for the content because I knew it's going to be a great RPG which I'm going to enjoy. Overall, Baldur's Gate 3 is an amazing RPG from a passionate studio that's been making RPGs for over 2 decades. And I just love that we can see some of the same features from the first prototype in their newest games. It's oddly satisfying and nostalgic. And those would be all RPGs from Larian Studio.
What a nincompoop.
They started off as a small, passionate studio who wants to make great RPGs. They gradually improved with each new title they developed, which eventually led us to Baldur's Gate 3. I would highly encourage you to play all of these games, starting with Divine Divinity. Hell, you can even check the first prototype, I'll leave the link in the description. It's buggy and unfinished as all hell, but if you feel adventurous, you can try it out, why not? By the way, I recently made a second channel and I posted a video related to Larian's plans for the future, so check that out as well if you're interested. Speaking of supporting the channel, I just launched my personal store where you can buy some interesting t-shirts and hoodies. Check out some cool designs in the theme of the channel, like this RPG Zone hoodie or Nameless Hero t-shirt. But you'll find a lot more if you follow the link in the description. I think that's a great way to get something back for supporting the channel. And of course, you can always become a Patreon or a YouTube member and get your name on the end credits of my videos. Many thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.